Bridget flipped through the pages of the investigating officer's report, looking for anything that might pique her interest. The facts of the case seemed pretty straightforward. A farmer named Palmer, who lived out on the highway to Patton, Virginia, had heard what sounded like a gunshot in an abandoned barn on his property. He went to investigate, thinking it might be a hunter, as his property was posted with no hunting signs. When he entered the barn, he found the body of a woman lying in a pool of blood. He called 911 immediately. When officers and EMTs arrived on the scene, they found the woman dead from a single bullet wound to the heart. A note referred readers to the attached report from the medical examiner for details. The victim's car was found parked outside the barn, and documents in her purse, which had been left in the car, identified her as Kelly Russell, the wife of Barry Russell, a financial consultant in Richmond. Detectives who searched the scene found no signs of a struggle, nor were there any signs of a robbery. It did not appear that Mrs. Russell's purse had been disturbed. Her wallet still contained $125 in cash. No murder weapon was found at the scene, but a single 9mm shell casing was retrieved from the barn floor. Investigators subsequently determined that Mrs. Russell had been shot at close range with a 9mm pistol. The time of death was established at approximately 3:00 p.m. Idly, Bridget opened the medical examiner's report. Everything appeared routine until she spotted a photograph of the victim taken at the scene. Death from the bullet had been instantaneous, and Bridget expected to see fear or perhaps pain on the woman's face. Instead, the expression frozen on the face of the corpse was one of complete and total astonishment. Bridget's heart began to beat faster. This could be the one, she thought. After the usual expressions of sympathy for his wife's death, and half-hearted apologies for disturbing him in his time of grief, two detectives settled down in Barry Russell's home office to speak with him. "Mr. Russell, did your wife have any enemies, anyone who might have had a reason to wish her harm?" the older detective asked. "No," Barry said in surprise. "Everyone loved Kelly. I never heard anyone say an unkind thing about her." The detective nodded and made a note on the pad he carried. "How about the two of you? Any areas of disagreement? Any problems?" "No," Barry repeated. "So, your marriage was perfect in every way. No quarrels, no disagreements of any kind." The detective prodded. "Well, no, I wouldn't say that," Barry backtracked. "I mean, every marriage has some friction. You know, expenses, budgets, priorities, that sort of thing." The younger detective leaned forward. "So the two of you quarreled about money?" "We didn't quarrel," Barry said quickly. "We had a few disagreements, but nothing out of the ordinary." He glanced down at the detective's left hand. "I see you're wearing a wedding ring, detective. Do you mean to tell me you've never had a difference of opinion about spending with your wife?" The older detective chortled, and the younger one turned red. "Let's go back to the day of your wife's demise," he said. "What was she doing in that old barn on the Palmer place?" "I wish I knew, detective," Barry said. "Like I told the police before, she called me and asked me to meet her out there at 2:00. She said there was a big opportunity she needed me to see, but she didn't have time to discuss it just then. I wasn't too happy about going all the way out there, especially since I had an appointment in my home office at 4:00. But I promised her I'd be there." "But you didn't make it," the younger detective offered. "No, I didn't," Barry explained. "I had a flat tire on the way out there. It took me quite a while to put on the spare, and in the process, I got filthy dirty. When I finished, I barely had time to drive back home, shower, and change clothes before my client arrived at 4:00. "I see," the older detective muttered. "Why didn't you call AAA to help you change the tire?" "Simple," Barry said. "I'm not a AAA member." The detective nodded. "And what did Mrs. Russell say when you called her to tell her you couldn't make it?" Barry hung his head in embarrassment. "I didn't call her. In my haste to get out there, I drove off without my cell phone. By the time I got home, showered, and changed clothes, my client had arrived. And that was at 4:00 p.m., The older detective asked. Yes, Barry said. He was right on time. In between 2 o'clock and 4 o'clock p.m., was there anyone who might have seen you? Barry paused a moment. No, not that I'm aware of, he replied. The younger detective picked up the questioning again. So let's go back to when you arrived home. Would that have been about 3:30? Roughly, Barry nodded. And then you took a shower, put on a clean suit and tie, and met with your client. That's correct, Barry confirmed. And after the client left, what did you do? The man asked. I bundled up the dirty suit and took it to the dry cleaners, Barry answered. I see, the younger detective said. That was certainly convenient. What was convenient? Barry asked, confused. The younger detective peered at him closely. It was convenient that you had to take a shower as soon as you got home, he said, and it was convenient that you took your suit to the dry cleaners right away. Barry looked at him with a puzzled expression. I still don't understand. The detective stared at him intently. That would certainly eliminate any gunpowder residue or other forensic evidence of a shooting, he said. Barry's face assumed a look of anger and disbelief. Now wait just a damn second. I had nothing to do with my wife's murder. I told you I never even made it out to Palmer's farm. I can't believe you think I'm a suspect. The two detectives glanced at each other. Are you a suspect, Mr. Russell? Is there something about your wife's death that you'd like to tell us? The older detective asked shrewdly. Barry grew increasingly agitated. If I'm a suspect, I think I need legal counsel, and I'm not going to answer any more of your questions until I've talked to an attorney, he said defiantly. The two officers looked at each other again, and then rose in unison to leave. If you think you've done something that requires legal counsel, then that's your right. But we'll be back, Mr. Russell. I can guarantee you that. Bridget hit speed dial on her cell phone, and when the call was answered, she said, Hey, Jill, it's your little sister calling. Hey, came the voice on the other end. I was hoping it was you. It's been a few days since I've heard from you. Sorry I didn't call sooner, but I've been busy with my project. And guess what? I may just have found what I'm looking for. With that, she began to describe the Russell case, including what she learned from the investigating officer's report and the photo taken by the medical examiner. Wait a minute, BG, Jill interrupted. How did you get hold of the IA and the Mies report? Those are confidential documents. Bridget gave an embarrassed little laugh. Well, I might have let the officer think that I was still writing for the Criminals Channel, and I might have hinted that he would make a good subject for an on-camera interview when the channel does a segment on the case. She paused and then laughed again. You know how cops are always suckers for a little publicity, she teased. You've never been able to get over the fact that I joined the DC police force, Jill retorted good-naturedly. But I can tell you this. No flirty young writer would ever get confidential information out of me. The two sisters teased each other a bit more, but then Jill asked, So, what's the next step in your plan to become America's next great nonfiction author? The next step, Bridget told her, is to go down to Richmond and get the husband to participate in my project. And just how do you plan to do that? Her older sister asked skeptically. Simple, Bridget replied. I'll just go see him and ask him. In fact, I've got an appointment with him tomorrow. Immediately, Jill's voice took on a serious tone. Listen, Bridget, I want you to be careful with this guy. You know as well as I do that when a wife gets murdered, the husband is usually the primary suspect. If this guy killed his wife, he could easily kill again to protect his secret. Yes, ma'am, I promise to be careful, Bridget replied in a little girl voice, then immediately reverted to her natural tone. Seriously, Jill, I know you're right, but I'm a big girl now, and I know how to handle myself. I definitely won't get into a position where I'm vulnerable. Okay, Jill said reluctantly, but please take this seriously. If anything were to happen to you, I don't think I could stand it. I swear, Jill, Bridget replied solemnly, and I promise that I'll call you regularly and keep you posted on how it's going. Just don't make me drive down from D.C. and haul your flirty behind out of trouble, Jill threatened. The next morning, Barry was still fuming about the visit from the police detectives, but he composed himself because he had an appointment with a potential client. Given how slow things had been since the recession, he was eager for any new business he could get. When the doorbell rang, Barry was waiting in the entry hall and quickly let Bridget Callahan in. As he escorted her back to his home office suite, he took the time to assess what he hoped would be his next client. He guessed her to be about 30, the same age as Kelly, he thought. She had brown hair cut stylishly short and what appeared to be a slim, attractive figure under the business suit she wore. After they settled respectively into the sofa and chair on one side of his office, Barry poured them both a cup of coffee. He liked to make his clients as comfortable as possible, so they would be more willing to discuss their financial condition with him. After a sip of coffee, he looked at what he hoped would be his new client, being careful to keep his eyes on her face. "Now, Miss Callahan, why don't you tell me a little about your financial goals?" he said. She set the cup down on the coffee table and then folded her hands. "First, Mr. Russell, please accept my deepest sympathies on the loss of your wife. I know what a shock that must have been to you." "Thank you, Miss Callahan," he replied. "You're very kind." She went on smoothly. "Second, please accept my deepest apologies for having misled you somewhat. I'm not here to seek financial advice. I'm here to offer you a unique and mutually beneficial proposition." Barry gaped at her in surprise. "You're a salesperson?" he asked angrily. "Absolutely not," she replied coolly. "I've been a writer for the Criminals Channel for the past 5 years, and I have extensive experience in the area of criminal justice. Now, I want to write a book about the death of your wife and the subsequent investigation to identify and prosecute the perpetrator of this crime. To do this, I've come here to ask for your complete cooperation every step of the way." Her host stared at her in amazement. "Why on earth would I want to do that?" he asked. She gazed at him steadily. "Because if you don't, you are absolutely screwed." Barry stood up hastily. "If that's some sort of threat, I can assure you that it won't work on me. Now, I think it's time for you to leave, Miss Callahan." The young woman sat there, unfazed by his anger. "Please, Mr. Russell, allow me to explain. Give me 5 minutes, and then if you still want me to leave, I'll go away and you'll never hear from me again. Just 5 minutes, please." Barry sat down and folded his arms. "Very well, but just 5 minutes," he warned. Bridget opened the large handbag she had brought with her and extracted a tablet computer, which she consulted. "Mr. Russell, you've already had a visit from the police, and I'm pretty sure that it was a very disturbing experience." "How did you know that?" he asked in surprise. "For 2 reasons," she said, ticking them off on her fingers. "First, as I said, I've been involved with a lot of police investigations, and I know how they work. Lacking a clear-cut alternative, they always suspect the husband. But that's not fair." Barry burst out. "You're saying that I'm already tried and convicted just because Kelly and I were husband and wife?" Bridget ignored him. "The other reason I know is the news story in today's Richmond Times-Dispatch." "What story?" Barry demanded. "I haven't seen today's paper." She handed the tablet over to him. The web browser was open to the local news section of the Times-Dispatch. Under the headline, "Police Question Husband in Russell Slaying," the story noted that detectives had seen Barry for a second round of questioning and described him as a person of interest. The reporter went on to add that no charges had been filed at this time. The rest of the article was a recap of the crime itself. "This is horrible," Barry moaned when he'd finished reading. "This makes it sound like it's only a matter of time before I'm arrested." When Bridget merely nodded, Barry slumped down in his chair. "I thought in America you were innocent until proven guilty in a court of law." "That's true," Bridget said, "but you're already being tried in the court of public opinion, and from now on, you're going to face an uphill battle." Before she could continue, the phone on Barry's desk rang. He stepped over to look at the display and then said, I need to take this call. This is a longtime client of mine." When she nodded, he picked up the receiver and said, "Hello, Tom. What can I do for you today?" He listened for a while, and a frown shadowed his face. "Tom, you've been a client for a long time. Aren't you satisfied with the results of your portfolio?" There was another long pause, and his frown deepened. "Surely you don't believe that," he said finally. "No matter what your wife's friends are saying, I had nothing to do with what happened to Kelly. My God, I loved her." After another long pause, his shoulders slumped and his voice sank. "All right, Tom. I understand. Maybe after all this gets cleared up, we can do business together again." He slowly hung up the phone and then walked back to the chair. "I can't believe that," he said in a low voice. "That was one of my oldest clients calling to cancel his business because his wife and her friends believe I was responsible for Kelly's death." Bridget slid across the couch to pat Barry's hand in sympathy. "I'm so sorry, Barry. But this is exactly what I was talking about. Because the police haven't arrested anyone, people are starting to make guesses about what happened, and it's not surprising that those guesses start with you." Barry held his head in his hands. "I would never have believed it if I hadn't gotten that call. I just can't understand how people who have known me for so long could assume that I'm capable of murder. It's a terrible thing, Barry. But the absence of evidence just adds fuel to the fire. People assume that there must have been something going on they didn't know about." She shook her head. "And that's not the worst of it either. Even if you're completely exonerated, there will still be people who don't hear about it, or even worse, don't believe it. Juicy gossip is much more powerful and engaging than mere facts. The doubts and accusations often live on, even after a case is closed. And I guarantee you that any good news about you won't get as much publicity as the bad." "I just can't believe this is happening," Barry said, despairing. "What do I have to do? Change my name and move to another country?" "I think there is another option, and that's why I'm here," Bridget said. "I told you, I'm a writer. Let me write your story. Open up to me, share your thoughts and emotions along with the facts of the case, and let people see the truth." "But how is that any different from the stories they run on the Criminals channel you used to write for?" he asked. "It's completely different," Bridget stressed. "In the first place, all those shows on TV are about crimes that occurred years ago. Second, they only do segments about guilty people, never about people wrongly accused. I want to write about a case as it unfolds. I want to show what the accused experiences, what's going on inside him or her." She paused and took a deep breath. "Did you ever read In Cold Blood by Truman Capote?" When he shook his head, she continued, "It's probably the greatest non-fiction book about crime ever written. Part of what made it so unique was that Capote was given such extensive access to the two killers that he was able to learn about the relationship between them and describe their thoughts and emotions. Well, I want to go a step further than Capote. I want to follow a crime almost from the time it happens. I want to get at the truth before the facts are even established." "That all sounds very interesting, Miss Callahan. But what does it mean for me?" Barry asked. "It means everything, Barry," she said confidently. "Nobody has ever done anything like this before, and it's bound to get a lot of attention in the media. My book will guarantee that people know not only that you were exonerated, but what you had to go through during the whole process. I'll bet you'll see people falling all over themselves to apologize for having doubts about you. You'll be welcomed back into society with open arms." Barry stared at her as she wound up her description. Then his face took on a cryptic expression. "There's just one problem with all that," he said. When she looked at him questioningly, he continued, "What happens if I'm guilty?" Bridget stared at him in surprise and swallowed hard, but then she regained her composure and said, "Then I'll come visit you in prison." He stared at her for another long second, and then looked down at the story in the Times-Dispatch. Finally, he nodded and stuck out his hand. "All right, Bridget, you've got a deal. Hey sis, guess what? I met the guy, and he's actually willing to let me write his story. He's agreed to open up, and let me see what he thinks and feels. This could be my big break. Way to go, Beji. I'm no literary expert, but it sounds to me like you're really onto something new here. Anyway, now that you've met the guy in person, what are your first impressions? Well, he appears to be intelligent and successful, at least up until recently. The recession hurt his business, and now, being under a cloud of suspicion about his wife's death, is already starting to have further repercussions. That's not what I'm asking, BG. Do you think he's guilty or not? You just can't stop being the cop, can you, sis? But to answer your question, I'm not sure. At first, I was inclined to believe he's innocent. He doesn't seem to me like the kind of man who would murder his wife. I heard him talking about her to one of his clients, and he seemed genuinely distraught about her death. But there was one thing that gave me pause. I was telling him about my book and how it would help people understand that he was innocent, and when I finished, he asked, "But what if I'm guilty? Why would an innocent man say something like that?" Jill was silent for several moments. Finally, she spoke up. "Bridget, you watch yourself around that man. If he were truly innocent, I can't see why he would even raise the possibility of his guilt. He might just have a quirky sense of humor, but that troubles me." "Yeah, I know what you mean, sis. Anyway, I'll let you know what I find out tomorrow, and don't worry. I'll be careful." The next morning, as she settled down on the couch in Barry's office, Bridget said, "I hope I'm not keeping you away from taking care of your clients." "Don't worry about that," Barry said bitterly. After that article in the newspaper, the only calls I've had from my clients were 2 more who called to terminate my services. I can't believe how quickly people are ready to condemn someone. He gave a wry smile. "Anyway, if you weren't here, I wouldn't have anyone to talk to at all." She gave him a sympathetic look and then glanced down at her notes. "Then let's get started," she said. "Why don't you begin by telling me about yourself?" He settled back in the side chair and took a sip of his coffee. "There's not all that much to tell, really. I was born here in Richmond, and I've lived here all my life, except for when I went to college at UVA in Charlottesville. I majored in finance and had planned to get my MBA after I graduated, but I got a really good offer from a major financial planning corporation and decided to give it a try. I soon discovered I had a real knack for financial planning, and I decided that an advanced degree wouldn't help me all that much. After a few years, I was doing well enough to believe I could make it on my own, so I left the firm and started my own practice. Things were going pretty well until the recession knocked the economy for a loop." Bridget was recording their conversation and also making notes. She looked up at Barry. "So what made you decide to strike out on your own?" she asked. "Did you always want to be your own boss?" "Well, that was part of it," Barry agreed, "but there was another factor as well. Around that time, my first wife and I split up." When Bridget raised her eyebrows in question, he continued, "She and I were high school sweethearts, and both of us went to UVA because we wanted to be together. We wound up getting married right after graduation, but the truth was that we developed into 2 different people with very different views on life during college. Those differences really began to emerge. She was very artistic and ultimately graduated with a degree in drama. She became increasingly idealistic, ready to march for any cause that came along. I'm much more pragmatic, more oriented toward numbers and results. I think the truth is that the only reason we got married was because we had dated so long that it seemed like the next inevitable step. But it took only a couple of years for us to realize that we should never have married in the first place. The split was as amicable as something like that can be." "What about the financial settlement?" Bridget asked. "Did you have to pay alimony?" "No," Barry said happily. "I was lucky. She believed that alimony was a form of male subjugation. All I had to do was pay for her to go back to college to get her MFA degree. Of course, her tuition pretty well blew through everything I had saved, but that was the end of my obligation to her." He gave a little smile. "We're still on speaking terms. I even get a card from her every year on my birthday and at Christmas." Bridget added a few more notes to herself. "So at that point, you were in your mid-20s, divorced, employed, but essentially broke." He smiled again. "That's about it. So I took stock of myself and decided that if I ever wanted to go out on my own, that was the perfect time to make the leap. No dependents, no obligations. So I quit, set up my own agency, and started hustling. I caught a few breaks, and things started going well. Then they started going really well when I met Kelly." Bridget sat up a little straighter. "How did that happen?" He seemed almost embarrassed. "To be honest, I met her through one of those online dating services." When she gave him a questioning look, he went on hastily, "You wouldn't believe how hard it is to meet eligible, attractive women once you're out of college. I was working 70 and 80-hour weeks. I didn't have time to hang out at bars or go to clubs, so I decided to give the online service a try. And that's how I found her. Although, now that I think about it, she actually found me first. Anyway, we hit it off the first time we went out together. We just seemed to have so much in common. Our values, our attitudes, our interests. It seemed like everything I liked was her favorite too. Even our histories were similar. She'd just gotten out of a bad marriage in Atlanta and had moved up to Richmond to start fresh, just like me. She preferred a smaller city, not one of the big metropolises where you can get lost so easily." "How long did you two date before you got married?" Bridget asked. This time, Barry did blush. "We actually tied the knot only 6 months after we met. I know that sounds a little fast in today's world, but we both knew what we wanted and what we liked, and it just made good sense not to wait." Barry stretched out his hands, almost as if he were pleading with Bridget. "I know you've seen pictures of her, so you know how gorgeous she was. But it wasn't just her looks that attracted me. It was her style, her values, her attitudes, and most of all, it was her brains that got to me. She was every bit as intelligent and pragmatic as me." He leaned forward toward Bridget. "Let me give you an example. Apparently, she made out pretty well financially in the divorce, and she wanted to protect those funds just in case things didn't work out between us. I felt the same way about my business, so we agreed to sign a prenuptial agreement covering those assets in the event of a divorce. A lot of women would feel threatened by that suggestion, but she understood immediately that I was trying to protect both of us." He slumped back in his seat. "I'll never find another one like her." That evening, when she called her sister, Bridget was in a contemplative mood. "I know I'm supposed to maintain a level of detachment," she said, "but I can't help liking the guy. He just doesn't seem like the sort of person who would murder his wife." Jill's voice took on a tone that sounded like a professor at a lecture. "Bridget, do you know what a sociopath is?" she asked. "Of course I do," Bridget responded sharply. "And Barry is not a sociopath. I think he's an intelligent, caring individual who suffered a terrible loss and is now being unfairly accused. He certainly doesn't seem to be delusional in any way." "None of that means he's not a sociopath," Jill retorted. "Listen to some of the characteristics commonly observed in sociopaths, and I'm quoting now: superficial charm and good intelligence, absence of signs of irrational thinking, unreliability, untruthfulness and insincerity, lack of remorse and shame, antisocial behavior. The list goes on." "Where did you get all that stuff?" Bridget demanded. "It comes straight out of The Mask of Sanity by Hervé Cleckley. It's considered one of the foremost clinical descriptions of psychopathic and sociopathic behavior," Jill said firmly. "Well, I'm not convinced," Bridget said fiercely. "In the first place, a lot of those traits could be used to describe lots of people who are perfectly sane. Second, the absence of signs of irrational behavior is hardly proof that he's a nut. And finally, you don't know that some of those other characteristics, like untruthfulness and antisocial behavior, apply to Barry." "I'm not making accusations here," Jill replied. "I just want you to keep up your guard with this guy. If he is a sociopath, and I'm not saying that he is, just that he might be. Then he can be very charming and manipulative. All I'm saying is, keep your eyes open and don't take any risks, okay? All right, sis, all right, Bridget sighed. I'll be careful. You've always watched out for me. I won't do anything stupid. Bridget was just getting ready to leave for Barry's home the next afternoon when her cell phone rang. When she checked the display, she was surprised to see it was Jill calling again. I'm so glad I caught you, Jill said breathlessly. In all our talk last night about sociopaths, I completely overlooked something else you said. Didn't you tell me that Barry and Kelly had a prenuptial agreement? That's right, Bridget said. But what's so important about that? Did he tell you which one of them wanted the prenup? Jill asked eagerly. I'm not sure, Bridget replied. But I don't know why it matters. Don't you see? Jill said. That's the motive for the murder. Think about it. Barry's business is failing, and he needs an infusion of capital. She has money from her ex-husband, but Barry can't get at it by divorcing her because she has that prenup in place. But in the case of her death, the surviving spouse inherits everything. Follow the money, Bridget. It's the oldest motive in the books. When Bridget said nothing, Jill spoke up impatiently. Well, what do you think, Bridge? I never thought about the implications of their having a prenup, Bridget said quietly. I'll definitely want to look into that. Then, speaking hurriedly, she went on, Listen, sis, I'm running late. I'll give you a call later and let you know what I find out. Just stay on your toes, Jill said, just before Bridget hung up. As she pulled out in her car to head for Barry's home, Bridget's mind was in a whirl. Could he really be the murderer, she wondered. Could this all be nothing more than a case of greed? As she drove, she reminded herself that the two murderers in Capote's book were also mere thieves, and that didn't lessen the impact of the book in any way. But she was surprised at how disappointed she felt at the idea that Barry might turn out to be the killer. He just doesn't seem like the type, she thought sadly. Barry was working on a spreadsheet when Bridget finally arrived. As she came into his office, he noticed the expression on her face and knew immediately that something was wrong. What is it, Bridget? What's happened? Her face had a curious expression, and she remained standing rather than taking a seat on the sofa. Finally, she took a deep breath as though steeling herself for something unpleasant and spoke. I don't know whether you realized it or not, but yesterday you told me something that could provide a possible motive for murder. When Barry looked at her questioningly, she plunged ahead. You told me that you and Kelly had a prenuptial agreement that kept her premarital assets separate. As a result, the only way you could have access to her funds to bail out your business would be to inherit them in the case of her death. Barry stared at her for a long moment, and as she carefully watched him, Bridget realized she was holding her breath. Then he suddenly burst into laughter. Is that what's troubling you? There was no problem getting extra cash. Kelly was going to make a loan from her funds to my business to tide me over. We even had a contract drawn up specifying all the terms and conditions. I'm not sure where the contract is now, but I could probably find it if it would make you feel better. He paused and then went on more quietly. We were going to sign the contract the same night she was murdered, but we never got the chance. He sat down heavily on the office couch, apparently remembering his last interaction with his wife. Bridget sat down beside him, obviously relieved that there was such a simple explanation to the situation. I'm sorry, Barry. I should have known that things weren't the way they looked. It's just that I'm trying so hard to examine all possibilities, and this whole case is so puzzling. He looked at her understandingly. No, don't apologize. You're trying to do your job, and that means exploring every possible avenue. I'm just flattered that you didn't want to find me guilty. She gave him an embarrassed little smile. He smiled back and then stood up abruptly. Listen, having to deal with all this stuff is making me crazy. Let's not spend any more time on this today. I don't have any appointments this afternoon, and I'm sick of being cooped up inside now that spring is here. Let's go out and enjoy the good weather and put all this police stuff aside for a while. "That sounds good," Bridget said immediately, allowing Barry to lead her out to his car. "Where are we going?" she asked, but all he would do was smile and tell her to be patient. For one nervous moment, Bridget wondered if he was going to take her out west of Richmond to the farm where Kelly had died. But instead, he headed toward the north side of the city. Eventually, he turned onto Lakeside Avenue and drove until they reached the Lewis Chinter Botanical Garden. She looked at him curiously. "I have to admit, this is not what I was expecting," Bridget told him. "You are an unusual man. Every time I think I understand you, you surprise me." After they had entered through the gates, Barry led Bridget around to the right. Exploring the different gardens along the winding circular path, they ended up spending the entire afternoon wandering through the many gardens and exhibits. When they finally made it to the Asian Valley, Barry led Bridget to a bench beside a pond overhung by Japanese maples, and the two sat there enjoying the peacefulness of the setting. "I like to come to this place when I need to think," he told her with a smile. By the time they had returned to his car, the shadows were lengthening, and when Barry saw the time, he apologized to Bridget for keeping her out so long. She quickly dismissed his concerns. "This has been a wonderful day, Barry. It seems like I never have a chance to get away. This is the first time I've been able to forget everything else and just enjoy myself." He hesitated a moment, and then asked her if she had any commitments for the evening. When she replied that she didn't, he continued, "I don't know about you, but after all this walking, I'm starving. Would you have dinner with me?" Then, before she could answer, he added, "But with one condition, that we don't talk about crime or Kelly or anything like that." Bridget smiled and readily agreed. They left the botanical garden, and Barry drove downtown along the James River until they came to Bookbinder's, the old restaurant built in a refurbished tobacco warehouse. The evening was warm enough that they took a table out on the patio. Barry ordered a bottle of wine, and the conversation over dinner flowed easily. At first, they discussed what they had liked in the botanical garden. Then Barry went on to tell Bridget about other sites and activities in Richmond that she might enjoy. Afterward, the conversation drifted to other topics, and Barry entertained her with humorous stories about his college years and his adventures starting his own business. By the time they finished and were walking back to the car, the temperature had dipped enough that Barry offered his suit jacket, and when she nodded gratefully, he slipped it over Bridget's shoulders. Once they got back to the car, Barry drove them across the river on 14th Street and continued until they hit 301. Then he turned back north and drove them across the Robert E. Lee Bridge so she could have a good view of the city lights. When they finally returned to Barry's home office, he invited her in for a cup of coffee, and still chilly from the night air, she gratefully accepted. As they sat sipping the brew, an embarrassed look came over Barry's face. When Bridget noticed his expression, she asked him what was wrong. "You must think I'm the world's biggest egomaniac. I just realized that I spent the entire evening talking about myself," he said apologetically. No, I don't mind," she laughed. "I enjoyed learning more about you. Besides, isn't that what I'm supposed to do? Interrogate the subject of my book?" He smiled. "Well, now it's my turn to interrogate you, Miss Callahan. I'd like to know something about your history." She attempted to wave off his interest. "There's really not much to tell about me. I'm just one of those people who focus so heavily on my work that it doesn't leave much time in my life for anything else." "Well, do you have any brothers or sisters?" he asked. "Just one sister, Jill, who lives in D.C. She's a detective on the police force." "Really?" Barry replied. "Isn't that interesting? Both of you found careers in different aspects of criminal justice. I know she's a policewoman and you're a crime writer, but your focus is still the same. Is that a coincidence?" The smile left Bridget's face. "Well, Jill is my older sister, so it's not so odd that I'd be influenced by her." Barry pressed on. "But there must be more to it than that. What is it that drove both of you to pursue the criminal element? Was your father a policeman?" Bridget sat there silent and motionless, almost as if she were holding her breath, and her face turned pale. Then, to Barry's astonishment, her eyes closed, and huge tears began to run down her cheeks. She put her hands to her face and began to sob like a heartbroken child. Barry was stunned, unsure of what to do. He sat there, leaning forward in his chair uncertainly. After a few moments, Bridget began to speak in a halting voice through her sobs. "I was in the 7th grade when it happened. A friend's mother gave me a ride from school, and when I got home, the side door we always used was wide open. That wasn't normal, but I didn't think much about it. When I went in, I yelled to Mama that I was home, but she didn't answer. I yelled again, and when there was still no answer, I began to get worried. I walked through the living room and saw the floor lamp knocked over and the furniture out of place. Then I saw blood on the floor, and I remember I began to tremble all over. I don't know why, but I tiptoed back to my parents' bedroom. When I peeked in the door, I saw her foot sticking out from the other side of the bed. Barry's face had gone pale as he listened, but Bridget didn't notice because her eyes remained squeezed shut. It was obvious she was remembering every detail of the horrible scene. When I went over to look at her, I saw that her clothes had been ripped and torn from her. I remember especially that her panties were dangling from one ankle, but what I remember most was the blood, everywhere. After he was done sexually assaulting her, whoever it was had shot her in the stomach. I screamed her name over and over again, tugging on her hand, trying to get her to stand up. Jill always got home later than me, and she must have heard me because she came running into the room. She started bawling too, but she was older and stronger than me. She pulled me out of the bedroom and back into the living room. Then she called 911 and held me until the police arrived. Now Barry moved to her side and put his arm around her as she wept. "Oh God, Bridget, I'm so sorry. I can't imagine how horrible that must have been for you." Bridget looked up at him with red, haunted eyes. That wasn't the end of it. When Daddy came home, he got hysterical. They'd covered Mama up with a sheet, but he ripped it off and screamed when he saw what that monster had done to her. The police had to physically restrain him. In his agony, Daddy loved us. He was always watching out for us, always trying to protect us. She began to sob again, but Barry held her, shaken by her awful story. After a few minutes, she raised her eyes and looked at him. We didn't have any other family to live with. Our grandparents had died, and Mama and Daddy didn't have any brothers or sisters. The authorities wanted to put us in a foster home, but Jill was 18 by then, and she fought them. She finally became my legal guardian and raised me. Things were tight, but we had the money from Daddy's life insurance and Social Security, and we made it. Anyway, Jill decided right away that she was going to become a policewoman. I'm not as brave as she is, so I didn't follow her, but I was still fixated on criminals, one way or another. Both of us wanted to try to prevent something like that from happening to somebody else. With that, she buried her head in Barry's shoulder and wept some more. Barry held her lightly, rubbing her back the way a parent would soothe a grieving child. "I'm so sorry, Bridget. I don't know what to say," he told her quietly. Then, after a few minutes, he whispered, "I guess both of us have lost someone we love to violence." Startled, she pulled back to stare at him, and thought she saw a reflection of her own grief mirrored in his face. In her pain, she had completely forgotten about the fact that he had just lost his wife. She pulled him tightly back to her, and the two of them clung to each other like the lost souls they were. After some time, both of them calmed down. Bridget pulled back far enough to gaze into Barry's eyes, then leaned forward to kiss him gently on the lips. He returned the kiss with warmth and gratitude. Again, she pulled back to look at him, and this time he saw a look of determination in her eyes. She leaned in again, but this time her kiss was full of promise. The powerful emotions she had experienced were now transformed into passion, and her lips parted so her tongue could probe his. Almost instantly, the heat between them blazed up, and they were locked in a passionate embrace like lovers long separated from one another. Finally, Barry wrenched himself away and held her at arm's length, "Are you sure, Bridget?" he asked. Without hesitation, she replied, "I'm as sure as anything in my life." With that, he pulled her back into his embrace and began kissing her again. Abruptly, he swept her up in his arms and carried her back to the master bedroom, laying her on her back and stretching out beside her. Between kisses, they began to fumble at one another's clothing, desperate to remove all barriers between them. But as he tugged at her knit top, Barry thought he detected some hesitation in her movements, and when he ran his hand over her supple stomach, he could feel the tension in her muscles. "What is it, Bridget?" he asked anxiously. "Is something wrong? Do you want me to stop?" He pulled his hand away, but she grabbed it and brought it back to her. "No, don't stop," she said. "It's just that. Well, I've never done this before." Then she looked away in embarrassment. As he stared at her in astonishment, he leaned over and kissed her gently. "It's all right," he said soothingly. "I know just what to do." They made tender love, and after she climaxed, she rolled over on her back and lay beside him, still panting. Barry slipped out of bed and went into the bathroom. He returned a minute later with a wet washcloth and a towel, which he handed to Bridget. After she'd finished, he slipped into bed beside her and pulled the spread over the two of them. In minutes, they were both asleep. When the morning sun woke him, Barry rolled over to look at his alarm clock and was startled to see that it was an hour past his normal time to get up. Then he remembered what had happened the night before and spun around to look for Bridget, but she wasn't there. He glanced around the room, then got up to check in the bathroom, but she was nowhere to be found. When he returned to the bed, however, he spotted a note on the pillow she had used. "Hey, sleepyhead. I had an appointment first thing, so I let myself out. Bridget P.S. I'll call you. P.P.S. You snore. P.P.P.S. last night. Well, wow. Hey, Jill. Sorry I didn't call you last night. Where were you? I got a little worried when you didn't call. Sorry, sis, but something amazing happened. What did you do, Beiji? Did? Oh my God, you slept with him. I can hear it in your voice. Damn it, I never could keep secrets from you. It's like you read my mind sometimes. Are you crazy? I can't believe you let him seduce you. Do you know what a risk you were taking? He could have killed you, just like that beast killed Mom. No, Jill, no, it wasn't like that at all. He didn't seduce me. If anything, I seduced him. We were talking about Mama. You told him about her. Why would you do that, Beiji? We just got to talking about our pasts, and suddenly it all came spilling out. I was crying, and he held me and tried to comfort me. After I calmed down, I realized that his wife had been murdered, just like Mama. Then I was trying to comfort him, and somehow it all got hot and heated. And, well, now I'm not a virgin anymore. So he got you in a vulnerable emotional state, and then took advantage of your weakness. No, it was nothing like that. He was gentle and considerate and loving. I felt completely safe. I don't think he's even capable of violence. Listen to me, Bridget Callahan. No matter how lovey-dovey you're feeling, the fact remains that someone murdered his wife, and he's the only suspect with a possible motive. What's more, he has every reason to romance you because you're writing a book that could support his innocence. Of course he wants you to like him. I can see what you're saying, but you just don't know him like I do. Anyway, before you start another lecture, I promise that I'll be careful, and I'll do a better job of keeping in touch. Pinky promise, sis. All right, BG, but don't forget it. If anything happened to you, I don't know what I'd do. I feel the same way about you. The call came in mid-morning, and Barry answered quickly, hoping that it might be a new client. It wasn't. Instead, a muffled voice inquired, "Is this Barry Russell?" "Yes, I'm Barry Russell. The Barry Russell that was married to Kelly Russell." "Yes. What's this about?" "You think your wife was a saint, but she was really just a common hooker." "What the hell? I don't know who you are, But you have no right to insult my late wife. It's no insult to call a spade, Russell. You don't believe me? Well, you should, because she was banging Bill McAvoy right under your nose. Bill McAvoy. Kelly didn't even know him, and she would never do anything like that. Anyway, if you don't believe me, why don't you ask one of her friends? I'll bet they all knew. Hell, I bet half of them were helping her hide it from you. Listen, whoever you are, while you're sitting around mourning for her, they're probably all laughing at you behind your back. Who the hell are you? Barry yelled, but the line had already gone dead. A few minutes later, Barry was in his car, headed for the home of Jared and Susan Jackson. Barry and Kelly often socialized with the Jacksons, and Susan was probably Kelly's best friend. When Barry rang the doorbell, Susan answered. "Oh, Barry, you startled me. I wasn't expecting you." If you're looking for Jared, he's at work," she said uneasily. "Actually, I was hoping to speak with you, Susan. Do you mind if I come in for a few minutes?" he asked coldly. Of course," she said hastily. "Listen, I'm so sorry we haven't been by to see you since the funeral. It's been crazy around here, and we've had so much to do." He held his hand up to halt her babbling. Knowing Susan and how close she was to Kelly, Barry felt certain that she would try to protect her friend if he asked a simple yes or no question, so he decided to take a more aggressive tack. He crossed his arms and stared at her sternly. "How long did you know about Kelly and Bill McAvoy?" he demanded. He watched her face closely, and he saw her eyes widen in surprise. She stood there silently for a long moment, obviously groping for the right thing to say. That told him all he needed to know. The anonymous caller had been telling the truth. All the adrenaline that had been pumping through him ever since the phone call seemed to flow out of him, and he sank down in the chair behind him, putting his head in his hands. "What about Kelly and Bill?" he heard Susan say weakly. He looked up at her with wounded eyes. "Please don't lie to me, Susan. It's much too late for that," he said. Susan sat down across from him and nervously played with her hands as she stared at him. "Barry, I don't know what to say," she said in a pleading voice. "Just answer my question. How long was it going on?" Her eyes darted around the room as if looking for an escape route, but finding none, she spread her hands helplessly and answered, "I don't know. Maybe 6 months or so." 6 months, Barry thundered, and she shrank back at his anger. "How could you not say anything?" "I tried to warn her, Barry," Susan protested. "I told her she was playing with fire, but she wouldn't listen." Suddenly, Barry remembered something else the anonymous caller had said and asked, "Who else knew?" "I guess after a while, almost all of us," Susan said reluctantly. "Kelly hardly even tried to hide it. Some of us even wondered if you knew and it was some kinky thing you liked." "My God, you know me better than that," Barry yelled angrily. "I could never stand for something like that." Susan sat white-faced in the chair, retreating as far away from Barry as she could get. After a few moments, he regained his composure, and his face took on a sad expression. "Why didn't you tell me, Susan? 6 months. Why didn't you let me know?" She held her hands out in supplication. "I couldn't, Barry. She was my friend. I just couldn't." He stood up and stared at her coldly. "I thought you were my friend too. Thanks for nothing." Then he walked out the door and drove off, leaving a shaken Susan to reach for the phone to call her friends. Late that afternoon, Bridget pulled up to Barry's home and rang his doorbell. When he opened the door, she gasped in surprise. He was standing there holding a bag of frozen peas over his eye. "Oh my gosh, Barry, what happened?" "I got into a fight," he said as he ushered her into his office. "You got into a fight?" Bridget asked in disbelief. "That doesn't sound like you." Barry proceeded to recount the whole story, from the anonymous phone call through his encounter with Susan Jackson. "After she confirmed everything, I drove straight over to where McAvoy has an office. The creep inherited a fortune when his wife died of cancer, and now he spends most of his time fiddling with his stock portfolio. When I walked in, he was meeting with some guy who works for him, but I interrupted them. When I told him who I was, he was startled at first, but then he got a sneer on his face. I couldn't stand it, and threw a punch at him. Barry tried to smile, but the motion hurt his eye, and he gave an involuntary groan. Who knew that his assistant was a martial arts expert? Anyway, they dragged me out of the office, and McAvoy threatened to call the cops if I ever came back. Bridget was clearly taken aback. Barry, you committed assault and battery. He can have you arrested if he wants to press charges. I doubt if he wants to do that, considering why I went after him in the first place. Besides, I'm the one who was battered, not him. Bridget looked at him disapprovingly. For a guy who's just started a brawl, you don't sound very contrite. His expression darkened noticeably. I don't even know how I'm supposed to feel. I've been mourning the death of my wife all this time, and now I find out she was carrying on an affair behind my back. How do I feel? I'm angry, hurt, and confused, and I'm definitely not contrite about going after the creep she was cheating with. Bridget flinched at his outburst, yet she felt a wave of sympathy as she tried to imagine how conflicted he must feel. Barry, I'm so sorry all this has happened, and I can only guess at what must be going through your mind right now. She reached out to take his hand. Would you like to have company this evening, to talk it out? He shook his head, and once again his face twisted in pain. Truthfully, I just need some time by myself to process all this. It's so overwhelming to learn that everything you believed in is a lie. He took both her hands in his, and to Bridget, it looked like a fire had been lit behind his eyes. I can't believe she cheated on me. I also can't believe that all my so-called friends knew what she was doing and never told me about it. The fact that so many of them knew in the first place just makes it worse. Apparently, Kelly was acting like she didn't care whether I knew or not. It's as if she had no respect for me at all. That makes me so angry. As he spoke, he unconsciously tightened his grip on her hands, and finally, Bridget yelped, "Barry, you're hurting me." He instantly released her and apologized. "I'm so sorry, Bridget. I didn't realize what I was doing. You can see why it's better for me to be alone tonight." She nodded and reached up to touch his face. "I'll give you a call tomorrow to see how you're doing," she promised as she turned to leave. As she drove away, her brow furrowed in concern. I've never seen that side of him before, she thought. "Hey sis, it's me. What's the matter, bye? Yesterday your voice sounded like you were ready to burst into song, and tonight you sound like you've got the weight of the world on your shoulders. What's going on?" "Jill, I'm so confused about Barry. Let me tell you what happened today." Bridget recounted the events of the day to her sister, especially his attack on Bill McAvoy, and the anger she'd seen in him. "It's like he was a different person, sis. There was a rage in him like I'd never seen before. It scared me a little." Wow, that's quite a story. And it also raises some interesting questions. What if the motive for Kelly's murder was not money but jealousy? I don't need to tell you how many husbands have killed their wives for that reason. But that can't be right. Sis, he didn't find out about her cheating until today. We don't know that, Beji. All we know for sure is that he found out who she was cheating with today. What if he somehow learned she was unfaithful before today? What if he was the one who lured her out to that farmhouse and shot her for cheating on him? I don't know, sis. He wasn't acting that way when I talked to him this afternoon. Exactly, Beji. He was acting. That's what I've been trying to warn you about. Guys like him can be very convincing. I hear what you're saying, but I still don't think you're right. Well, while you're thinking about that, let me give you something else to think about. I've been doing a little investigating from up here, and I found out that being faithful wasn't the only thing Kelly lied about. What are you talking about, Jill? It turns out that Kelly Russell's history is a little more complicated than what Barry told you. In fact, I guess it's probably a little more involved than he knows. I did a trace on her, and here's what I found out. She came from a poor family that lived in Florala, Alabama, a small town right on the border between Alabama and Florida. She went to Florala High School, where she was a Wildcats cheerleader. She also started going steady with Johnny Rayburn. After graduation, she and Johnny started attending Jefferson Davis Community College up the road in Brundage, Alabama. Eventually, the two of them got married. Really? Bridget asked. I'm pretty sure Barry doesn't know about that. Wait, there's more. Apparently, she ditched Rayburn after only a year or two of marriage and headed for Atlanta. She must have been a real looker even back then, because she met her next husband while she was working as a bartender at Coyote Ugly. He was a contractor riding the construction boom in Atlanta. Anyway, they got married in short order, but after only a couple of years of marriage, he died suddenly of a heart attack. After that, she moved up to Richmond, and of course, that's where she met Barry. Wow, she was a busy girl. There's one more thing, Beji. The Atlanta police told me that the contractor's family never liked Kelly, and they didn't believe he had any heart problems. They've been pestering the police and the courts to reopen the investigation into his death. All that is interesting information, sis, and it will help flesh out my book, but I'm not sure how it fits into the immediate situation. Do you think that somebody in the contractor's family could be the murderer? I don't know, Beji. I'm just trying to help you gather enough clues that you can piece this thing together. But one thing is certain. Don't let down your guard around Barry Russell. Now he's got two possible motives for murdering his wife, and that's more than anyone else we know. So, no matter how charming he may be or how good he is in bed, please be wary of him. Promise me. Well, you don't have to worry about me for a while. I've got interviews lined up for the next 2 days with several other people who knew both Barry and Kelly, so I won't even see the guy anytime soon. Even though she was busy over the next 2 days, Bridget couldn't stop thinking about Barry. The confrontation he'd had with Kelly's lover had disturbed her, and she had taken her sister's warnings to heart. Yet she couldn't suppress the feelings that had been stirred in her after the night they'd spent together. A part of her desperately wanted to reconnect and try to understand what was really happening. So she was disappointed when he didn't even call. On the third day, she was excited when she checked her phone and found that she'd missed a call from him. But as she listened to his long message, her excitement turned to concern. Bridget, I just had a call from the same person who told me about Kelly cheating on me. I think it was a guy, but the voice was muffled, just like last time. Anyway, today he told me he has information on who killed Kelly. He wants to meet me at Palmer's Barn this afternoon at 5 o'clock. I'm supposed to come alone, or I'll never find out what really happened. I know it's chancy, but I'm going to do it. If I find out the truth, you'll be able to finish your book. And if I don't come back, at least you'll be able to tell the police where to look for me. The message concluded. Bridget was in a quandary. Like Barry, she was anxious to get more information about who killed Kelly Russell, and it was obvious that whoever made those phone calls knew a lot about Barry's late wife, maybe enough to solve the riddle. At the same time, she was terribly afraid for Barry. Venturing alone back to the same place where his wife had been murdered seemed terribly risky to Bridget. She desperately wanted to get Jill's advice, but when she tried to call her sister at the police station, she was told that Jill was out on a case. When she tried Jill's cell phone, it immediately went to voicemail. Hearing her sister's recorded voice seemed to make up Bridget's mind, and she left a long message explaining what had happened and what she planned to do. When she finished, she immediately tried to dial Barry, only to discover that her phone's battery had died. She cursed in frustration and tossed the dead instrument into her bag. If I can get out to that farm early, I can be in position to see who comes to meet Barry, she thought. I'll have to worry about recharging the phone later. A few minutes later, Jill returned to the police station. Hey, the sergeant on duty yelled at her. You got a call from your sister while you were out. Jill quickly turned on her cell phone, and after it connected to the network, the message light came on. When she heard Bridget's message, Jill felt a cold chill run down her back. Desperately, she pushed the speed dial for her sister, only to get her voicemail. Beji, it's me. Do not go out to that barn. Do you hear me? It's a trap. There was no mystery phone call. Barry just made that up to lure you out there. He's going to kill you just like he killed his wife. Call me back as soon as you get this message. But whatever you do, don't go out there." As soon as she finished, she called the Richmond police and asked for the detective handling the Russell case. Told that he wasn't available, she asked for the sergeant on duty and tried to explain her fears. It was obvious to Jill that the sergeant didn't understand the urgency of the situation, but he promised to have a patrol car drive out to the farm. Finally, Jill hung up the phone, frustrated that the officer hadn't seemed to grasp what was happening. "Oh God, what do I do now?" she moaned. There was almost no traffic on Anderson Highway once Bridget got past Route 200. She felt confident she could make it out to Palmer's farm in plenty of time to find a hiding place from which to observe Barry's rendezvous with the mysterious caller. But her confidence was shattered when the loud pop and mushy handling of the steering wheel told her she had a flat tire. "This is unreal," she protested as she pulled her rental car over to the shoulder of the highway. "This is the same thing that happened to Barry when Kelly was killed." She got out of the car and walked around to stare helplessly at the right front wheel. She'd never changed a flat tire in her life. Barry cautiously nudged the barn door open using the barrel of his father's old .30-30 Winchester. Barry hadn't fired the gun since his father had taken him hunting years ago, but he didn't want to walk into the barn unarmed. The darkness of the interior was broken only by a few shafts of light, where the corrugated tin roof had been pierced and torn. As far as Barry could see, the old structure was empty. Good, he thought. I got here first. He spotted some old bales of hay off to one side and settled himself behind them. He'd have a clear view of the door if anyone walked in. Bridget left the flat tire by the side of the road and tossed the jack back into the trunk, not bothering to secure it. She got behind the wheel and quickly pulled back onto the highway, hoping she'd installed the spare correctly. "Just let me get to that barn in time," she cast a silent prayer. Barry's eyes had adjusted to the gloom, and in the quiet, his ears picked up all the creaks and groans the old barn made every time a gust of wind hit it. As a result, he heard the soft footsteps on the floor behind him. Before he could spin around, a blow to the back of his head sent him tumbling into darkness. It was the pain in his head that awakened him. When he lifted his head off the ground, his stomach lurched, and he vomited to one side. Definitely a concussion, he thought detachedly. Then the pain in his head resumed, and when he tried to touch it, he discovered that his hands and feet were bound. His fingers registered the texture of dusty leather, and he realized he must have been tied up with the old ropes he'd spotted hanging from the barn walls. A part of his brain marveled that he was able to think so rationally, given how badly his head hurt. Then his ears picked up a new sound, and he lifted his head carefully to gaze at the barn door. As he watched, it opened slowly, and a shadowy figure entered. "Well, well," said a masculine voice. "Looks like you were a good boy and didn't bring anybody with you." Barry struggled to sit up and finally succeeded, but only at the price of another spasm of pain from the back of his head. He gasped, but when the spasm passed, he was able to focus again on the figure who had spoken. It was a man, but Barry felt certain he had never seen him before in his life. "Who are you?" he groaned through his pain. "Oh, that's right. We haven't been introduced," the figure said mockingly. "You don't know me. I'm Kelly's husband." Barry gaped at the man in confusion. "But I'm her husband," he said stupidly. "No," the man replied. "You were just her latest victim." Barry wondered if the blow to his head had done more damage than he thought. "You mean you're the guy she was married to in Atlanta?" He tried again. No, the man said angrily. "I'm Johnny Robburn, her real husband." Seeing the blank look on Barry's face, the man began to pace back and forth in front of him. "Kelly was my high school sweetheart down in Florala, and we got married while we were at Jeff Davis. But the economy turned bad, and I couldn't find a decent job. See, Kelly always had a taste for nice things. Things I couldn't buy her, So, after a while, she just took off, looking for something better, I guess. It took me a while, but I finally tracked her down in Atlanta, where she was working at some bar. She told me she was glad to see me, but by then she'd found some rich builder who could afford to buy her all the nice things she wanted. She told me she had a plan so we could be together again, but I had to lay low until she could get him to marry her. Well, he did marry her, of course, because nobody could ever resist Kelly. Then after a while, she called me to help her with her little plan. One night, she gave him some real good loving, and later, when he was lying in bed all screwed up and drowsy, I sneaked into the room and jumped on his chest. Rabern gave a gleeful laugh. He couldn't even get his arms out from under the covers. You should have seen his face before I shoved that pillow into it. After I finished and got out of there, Kelly was cool as ice. She lay back down and slept beside his body the rest of the night, so it would look like she woke up the next morning and found him dead in his sleep. He shook his head. I don't know if I could have done that, but it didn't bother her none. Then Rabern scowled. I guess that fat pig had the last laugh on her, though, because afterward she found out he was up to his eyeballs in debt, and Kelly didn't get hardly anything out of him. So she told me she'd have to find herself another rich sucker before her and me could get back together. Since things were getting a little hot in Atlanta, she decided to move again. Even in his pain, Barry couldn't help spitting out. And that's when she moved to Richmond and found me. Rabern laughed derisively. Yeah, Barry Russell, the big money man. But you were another disappointment. When your business started going down the toilet, she decided not to wait to find her next prospect. I guess that's where Bill McAvoy came in, Barry said bitterly. Right on, smart boy. Except she had to get rid of you first, which was when she called me. But wait, Barry protested. Why bother killing me? She could have just divorced me and moved right into McAvoy's bed. Rabern looked at Barry as though he were an idiot. Well, she had to get at least something for her trouble, didn't she? And since you had that damn prenup, the only way to get any money out of you was for you to die. Barry was still confused, but it was Kelly who got killed, not me. A look of anger twisted Rabern's face. She had it all set up. I was hiding here in the barn, and you were supposed to come in and get shot by an unknown gunman. But you didn't show, and suddenly she came busting through that door to see what had happened, and I shot her by accident. It was all your damn fault. The man began to wave the gun in Barry's face, and Barry groped desperately for some way to distract or at least delay him. Try as he might in his weakened state, he was having no luck getting his hands free. You don't have to do this, Johnny. There's nothing to be gained by killing me now. Just leave me here and get away while you can, Barry pleaded. The man began to pace back and forth again in agitation. No, I have to finish it. She loved me. I've got to do what she told me. But just as he began to raise his gun again, a voice outside began yelling, Barry, Barry, are you in there? Are you okay? Before Barry could warn her, Bridget burst into the barn, only to stop short in dread when she saw Johnny Rabern level his gun at her. So you did bring a friend along after all, he chortled, giving her a long look and smiling wolfishly. And a pretty one too. I guess I've got two of you to take care of now. He gave Bridget a long look and smiled wolfishly. But first, I'm going to have a little fun with you. It's been a long time since I've had a woman. No, Bridget screamed, and tears began to run down her face. Stay away from me. Rabern ignored her, tucking his pistol into his belt behind his back, and began to advance on the woman in front of him. Barry suddenly remembered what had happened to Bridget's mother and felt sick at heart. She must be about to lose her mind with fear, he thought. Get away from her, he yelled helplessly, but Rabern ignored him. Then, as Barry watched the scene in horror, he realized that something looked off about Bridget's expression. That's not fear, he thought. That's rage. As Rabern reached for her, he crowed, I'm going to enjoy this. In a loud voice, Bridget screamed out, not this time. To Raburn's and Barry's amazement, she reached behind her, yanked out a snub-nosed .38, and pulled the trigger. The bullet, fired at such close range, caught Raburn in his midsection and doubled him over. He stumbled backward, fell flat on his back, and lay moaning on the straw-covered dirt. Bridget stared at the writhing figure for a moment, then ran to Barry and knelt beside him, crying as she hugged and kissed him. "Are you all right, Barry?" she asked frantically. "My head hurts like hell," he told her, "but I think I'll be okay." "Thank God you're all right. Can you help me get my hands free?" As she tugged at his bonds, they heard another voice yelling, "Bridget! Bridget, are you in there? Are you okay?" They looked up to see a woman holding her pistol in the two-handed weaver position come through the barn door. "Jill!" Bridget screamed, and the two sisters ran to each other and embraced, crying in their relief. When they had calmed down somewhat, Bridget asked, "How did you get here?" Jill held her tightly. "When I got your voicemail, I drove down from D.C. in a police cruiser with the siren on the whole way. I told you I'd never let anything happen to you." As Bridget hugged her in gratitude, Jill looked suspiciously over at Barry and at Raburn, who lay moaning on the floor of the barn. "What did Barry do to you, and who's that other guy?" "Oh God, I forgot about Barry," Bridget cried, tugging on her sister's arm. She pulled her toward him. "Help me untie him." As the two women struggled with the old leather ropes, Barry saw motion from the body lying on the barn floor and cried out, "That's Johnny Raburn over there. He has a gun in his pants." Jill quickly moved to the prone figure and rolled him over to find the pistol still stuffed in his waistband. She grabbed it and tucked it in her belt. As she did so, Raburn gave a terrible cry. Jill rolled him back over and checked his wound, then grabbed her phone and called 911, ordering an ambulance and the police. When she returned to Barry's side, he told her, "I think if you run a ballistics check on the pistol you just took, you'll find it matches the one that killed Kelly." Jill looked at Barry and then at Bridget. So her first husband was the one behind all this. Barry nodded, and from what he said, I don't think the two of them were ever legally divorced. He glanced over at Raburn and noticed how pale he had grown. "How's he doing?" he asked Jill in a quiet voice. "He's bleeding heavily," she said. "There's not much I can do for a bullet wound in the stomach. I don't think he'll last till the EMTs get here." Bridget gave a little whimper at that, and Jill reached over to hug her. "It's all right, Bridget. You did what you had to do. I'm proud of you." Barry gave Bridget a puzzled look. "I didn't know you even had a gun. Where did that come from?" Bridget gave an embarrassed shrug. "Jill gave it to me years ago after what happened to Mama. I've always hated guns, but Jill insisted I keep it with me for protection. I've had it in my purse all these years, but this is the first time I've ever fired it." Just then, Johnny Raburn groaned again. The three of them moved over to kneel beside him, and Raburn opened his eyes. Seeing Barry, he spoke in a gasping voice. "I lied to you, man. It wasn't an accident. When she came into the barn and saw you weren't here, she got angry. I begged her to forget the plan and go away with me. That's when she told me she didn't love me and that she would never take me back. Then she laughed at me, and I shot her." Barry, Bridget, and Jill exchanged glances. Raburn's voice was noticeably weaker. Barry glanced down and saw that the effort to talk had forced more blood out of the wound in the man's stomach. Then, to their amazement, Raburn began to laugh. "You can't get away from me now, Kelly. This time, I know where you've gone, and you better get ready, 'cause I'm going there too." He laughed once more, and then his head dropped back to the dirt, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. Jill reached over and felt for his carotid artery. Then she shook her head and closed the dead man's eyelids. While they waited for the EMTs and the police, Barry managed to recount everything Raburn had revealed about what really happened, and Jill added details on what her research had uncovered. Later, when the medical technicians arrived and decided to take Barry to the hospital for observation, Bridget insisted on following him in her car. Jill volunteered to stay and give the police the whole story. After Barry was strapped to a gurney for the ambulance ride back to Richmond, Bridget came over and kissed him before heading to her car to follow him. Then Jill came over and patted his arm. "I owe you an apology, Barry," Jill said. "I was convinced that you were a sociopath. I thought you'd murdered Kelly and were likely to try the same with Bridget. Now it turns out that Kelly was the real sociopath, and her first husband was her killer. I'm sorry I doubted you." Barry smiled at her. "No problem, Jill. I understand." She looked at him solemnly. "Just don't you ever do anything to hurt my little sister." Barry glanced over at the attendants loading Johnny Raburn's body into the other ambulance, then looked back up at Jill and shook his head. He smiled and said, "I wouldn't dare."